Why would a government spend months rebuilding a mountain while refusing to let a single inspector walk through its front door? And why now, in the exact window when it is publicly insisting it wants peace more than anything else? There's a place in central Iran that most of the world has never heard the name of. And yet analysts studying it right now believe it may be the single biggest unresolved question standing between the region and its next war. Bigger in some ways than the funerals, the missile stockpiles, or the disputed shipping fees dominating the daily headlines, because unlike those visible flashpoints, this one is happening almost entirely out of sight, verified only through the patient, unglamorous work of analysts poring over commercial satellite passes week after week. Picture the scene as it actually exists today, not as it looked in archived footage from earlier this year, but as the newest imagery from just days ago actually shows it. It's the 8th of July, 2026, and it has been more than 4 months since the guns fell silent between the United States, Israel, and Iran. A ceasefire holds. A memorandum of understanding sits signed at a resort overlooking Lake Lucerne in Switzerland. On paper, this is peace. But peace on paper and peace on the ground are not always the same thing, because while diplomats shook hands back in June, satellites in orbit were quietly photographing something else entirely. Something happening roughly a mile south of Iran's Natanz nuclear complex, buried inside a mountain the Iranians call Kuh-e-Kolangazla. The world has taken to calling it by a simpler name, Pickaxe Mountain. And here is where it gets interesting, because this is not a hole dug in a panic after the war started. Construction at this site goes back years, long before the missiles ever started flying. And the most recent imagery obtained by the Washington-based Institute for Science and International Security shows something that should not, according to the very agreement Iran just signed, be happening at all. Vehicles, cranes, and construction crews actively reinforcing the tunnel entrances as recently as the closing days of June. Think about what that timing actually means. This is not old footage being recycled to manufacture outrage. This is current. This is happening in the same weeks that Iran has been staging a nationwide funeral for its slain supreme leader, in the same weeks that its foreign minister has been sitting across the table from American negotiators, insisting that Iran is committed to transparency and de-escalation. And it is where the story gets its real weight, because the terms of that memorandum, signed on June 17th, explicitly require Iran to maintain what negotiators call the status quo of its nuclear program, meaning no construction at nuclear-related sites while talks continue. Pickaxe Mountain is, by any reasonable definition, a nuclear-related site, and it is, right now, under active construction. Read that again, because this is the sentence the entire story hinges on. A government that just signed a document promising to freeze its nuclear infrastructure is simultaneously pouring concrete, moving earth, and hardening tunnel entrances at the one facility connected to its nuclear program that international inspectors have never been allowed inside. So let's go inside the geography of it, because the physical scale here is what makes this so hard to dismiss as routine engineering work. The mountain harboring this tunnel complex stands over 1,600 meters above sea level, more than 50% taller than the mountain that concealed Fordow, the facility American bunker-busting bombs struck directly last year. That elevation difference matters enormously from a targeting standpoint, because greater mountain height above a tunnel complex generally means more rock overhead protecting whatever sits inside, which is precisely why the Institute's own president has described this newer site as potentially even harder to destroy through aerial attack than Fordow ever was, and Fordow itself was already considered nearly impossible to fully eliminate from the air. Analysts studying years of satellite imagery estimate the tunnel network extends deep into that solid granite, with portals identified on the western, eastern, and southern faces of the complex, and a security perimeter wall now encircling the entire facility. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle anyone tracking the story. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the same body responsible for verifying whether nations are honoring their nuclear commitments, has never been granted access to the site. Not once. Its precise purpose has never been officially confirmed by the Iranian government. Years of visible construction, and to this day, 0 inspections. Iran's own parliament speaker has publicly stated that no access will be granted to any of the country's bombed nuclear sites, a position that, whatever its stated justification, leaves the exact function of Pickaxe Mountain entirely undefined for the outside world. But here's where it gets worse, because the contrast between this site and everything else in Iran's nuclear infrastructure is stark enough to raise the stakes considerably. Iran's 3 publicly declared nuclear facilities, Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, remain in ruins from the war that ended earlier this year. According to the same institute tracking Pickaxe Mountain, there is no observed activity at Isfahan as of late June, where tunnel portals remain backfilled with dirt, exactly as the strikes left them. At Fordow, buried inside its own mountain north of the holy city of Qom, analysts have documented something almost eerie in its precision. Earthen and rocky mounds placed at deliberate intervals along the access roads, arranged in a pattern engineers describe as creating a series of chicanes, obstacles positioned not simply to block the road outright, but specifically to slow and complicate any attempt at rapid vehicle access. The most recent passes confirm those objects remain exactly where they were placed weeks earlier, and the tunnel portals themselves stay backfilled with dirt. At Natanz itself, the freshest imagery from late June shows almost no activity at all. The underground enrichment hall's access points still haven't been repaired, personnel entrances remain destroyed, vehicle entrances remain severely damaged, and the facility's primary and backup power systems, along with its displaced cooling infrastructure, sit exactly as the strikes left them months ago. Only a single vehicle has been spotted anywhere near the ruins of the pilot fuel enrichment plant, a structure Iran quietly covered over after it was destroyed. 3 of Iran's 4 no-nuclear sites, in other words, sit frozen exactly where the war left them. And this is where everything changes, because the 4th site, the one nobody has ever been allowed to inspect, is the only one actively growing. Since the ceasefire took hold, satellite imagery shows Iran has partially filled in some of the tunnel portals at Pickaxe Mountain, restricting vehicle access to at least one section, while appearing to seal off a smaller tunnel complex nested within the larger site's perimeter. A tunnel inside a tunnel, sealed and unaccounted for. What exactly sits behind that seal, nobody outside Iran's government can say with certainty. Analysts have been careful in their public assessments not to claim more than the evidence supports, and it is worth being equally careful here, rather than reaching for the most dramatic possible conclusion. The Institute's own reporting states plainly that despite the ongoing construction, there is currently no indication the facility is ready for operational use, and that the visible infrastructure, including what appears to be a single ventilation shaft with above and below ground power lines, seems insufficient on its own to support active uranium enrichment inside the tunnels as they currently exist. So this is not, at least not yet, a confirmed secret enrichment plant humming away undetected. What it is, according to the people who study this facility for a living, is something almost more unsettling in its ambiguity. A heavily fortified, deliberately opaque construction project expanding in real time, whose builders have spent years ensuring nobody outside their own government can determine what it is actually for. And that ambiguity matters enormously, given what else Iran is known to be sitting on. According to nuclear monitors, Iran holds a stockpile of roughly 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, a level of enrichment that sits well above what is needed for civilian power generation, and meaningfully closer, technically speaking, to weapons-grade material than anything a peaceful energy program requires. Most of that stockpile is believed to be stored at Isfahan, with smaller quantities at Natanz and Fordow, though its precise condition and location following the war's bombing campaign remains one of the 2 largest unresolved threats that neither the American nor Israeli military has publicly confirmed neutralizing. Israeli defense officials, more than 2 weeks into the war itself, declined to offer assurances that either the enriched uranium stockpile or the Pickaxe Mountain facility would be dealt with before hostilities ended. Foreign reporting at the time raised, without confirming, the possibility of covert operations aimed at seizing or diluting the material. No such operation has ever been publicly acknowledged, which means the uranium, as far as any public record shows, is still somewhere in Iran. And the one facility with the depth, the fortification, and the total absence of oversight necessary to potentially house it in secret is the one facility actively under construction, while everything else sits in rubble. Nobody has proven the uranium is inside that mountain, but nobody has proven it isn't. And that gap, sitting at the center of an active ceasefire, is precisely the kind of gap wars restart over. It helps to understand how long this particular mountain has actually been part of Iran's story, because the timeline reshapes how you should read everything happening there today. Construction at Kolan Gazla did not begin as a wartime improvisation or a rushed response to bombing. Satellite analysts have traced visible work at the site back to 2020, years before the 12-day war that would eventually devastate Natanz, Fordow, and Isfahan, which means whatever Iran intended this mountain to become, the planning long predates the current crisis entirely. In the years before the war, Iranian officials offered one explanation for the excavation, describing it publicly as the future home of an advanced centrifuge assembly plant, a facility meant to manufacture the machines used to enrich uranium rather than to enrich uranium itself. That explanation may well be true, at least in part. But the scale of what has actually been built there, tunnel portals on 3 separate faces of the mountain, a security perimeter encircling the entire site, hundreds of feet of reinforced excavation into solid granite, goes considerably beyond what a simple assembly workshop would plausibly require. And it is that mismatch between the stated purpose and the physical reality that first drew sustained attention from nuclear monitors years before the current ceasefire ever existed. Then came the war itself. On the 28th of February, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military campaign that would go on to kill Iran's supreme leader and much of his family, devastate the country's declared nuclear infrastructure, and coincide with a brutal crackdown on domestic protests that had begun even before the fighting started. Notably, even amid a campaign that struck nuclear sites across the country, Pickaxe Mountain itself was not among the facilities directly targeted, a decision analysts have puzzled over given how central the site had already become to concerns about Iran's covert capabilities, and one that has never been fully explained by either government involved. When the guns eventually fell silent and negotiators sat down to hammer out the framework that would become last month's memorandum, the mountain that was never bombed became almost immediately the mountain everyone started watching most closely, precisely because it was the one piece of Iran's nuclear architecture that emerged from the war essentially intact. It is a global stability story because the entire architecture holding the current peace together rests on the assumption that both sides are actually honoring the terms they signed. Israel, worth noting clearly, is not even a party to this memorandum. The agreement was negotiated bilaterally between Washington and Tehran, brokered with Pakistani and Qatari involvement at that hotel complex in Switzerland, and Israeli officials have been open about their frustration with it, arguing publicly that the document fails to secure any concrete, verifiable commitment from Iran to permanently dismantle its nuclear capability, rather than simply pause it. Every fresh satellite image showing cranes moving at Pickaxe Mountain hands Israeli hardliners exactly the argument they have been making since the ink dried, that Tehran is treating the ceasefire as a tactical pause rather than a genuine change of course, buying time to rebuild and reposition rather than genuinely standing down. Analysts at the institute tracking the site have said plainly that halting construction and finally granting inspectors access would represent the single clearest good faith signal Iran could send to prove it has actually abandoned what they describe as a long-standing pattern of concealment. So far, the satellite record shows the opposite happening. There's also a supply chain dimension to this story that rarely gets attention alongside the satellite photographs, and it matters because a mountain fortress is only as significant as the equipment and materials that end up moving through it. Reporting based on customs data and interviews with weapons analysts has documented that small Chinese firms have continued openly marketing and shipping dual-use components toward Iran, including specialized engines, batteries, fiber optic cable, and computer chips. Technology with legitimate civilian uses that also happens to be exactly what is needed to keep a sanctioned military-industrial apparatus running. One specific supplier has reportedly offered German-designed engines barred from export to Iran, engines linked directly to the same attack drones Iran has exported to Russia for use in Ukraine, drones that cost as little as $20,000 to produce and carry a range approaching 1,000 miles. None of that reporting ties directly to Pickaxe Mountain specifically, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise without evidence. But it establishes something important about the environment this mountain exists inside. A sanctions regime that has proven porous in practice, a network of suppliers willing to route around restrictions for the right price, and a government in Tehran that has shown across decades a consistent willingness to use exactly that kind of gray market access to keep sensitive programs alive, even under maximum international pressure. Consider, too, the precedent sitting uncomfortably in recent history. North Korea spent years insisting its own nuclear ambitions were peaceful, permitting selective, tightly managed access to inspectors, at moments when doing so served its diplomatic interests, all while quietly advancing a weapons program in facilities the world was never allowed to fully see until the day it detonated a device and the argument became moot. Nobody covering Pickaxe Mountain today is claiming Iran has already crossed that same threshold. The site's own construction pace, according to the analysts tracking it most closely, still looks more consistent with fortification and expansion than with an active, functioning enrichment operation. But the pattern, the selective transparency, the mountain nobody gets to enter, the official explanation that never quite accounts for the physical scale of what's been built, is close enough to that earlier precedent that regional governments watching this unfold are not inclined to give Tehran the benefit of the doubt twice. The entire diplomatic framework currently holding the region together depends on convincing skeptical allies, a skeptical Israeli government chief among them, that Iran can be trusted to hold its end of an agreement it has every incentive to quietly undermine. Every new set of satellite photographs showing continued work at a site the memorandum explicitly prohibits touching becomes a fresh crack in that argument. And Tehran's own public position offers no real reassurance. When questioned, Iranian officials have not denied that construction is ongoing so much as declined to explain its purpose at all, repeating in various forms the same essential message that has defined the country's approach to the site since before the war even began. Trust us and stay out. That posture might have been survivable in a world where the ceasefire was solid and permanent. It becomes considerably harder to sustain in a world where Israeli officials have said repeatedly and on the record since the fighting paused that the war they fought is not truly over, only interrupted, and where the Iranian government is simultaneously managing an unresolved succession crisis, a fractured negotiating team facing accusations of undermining its own leadership from hardliners inside its own parliament, and a domestic population still absorbing the aftershocks of a bloody crackdown on mass protests less than a year old. Consider for a moment what actual verification would even require, because it is worth being honest about how difficult resolving this ambiguity really is. Satellites are extraordinary tools. They can measure the length of a tunnel entrance to the meter, track the movement of individual trucks across weeks of imagery, and detect freshly poured concrete before it has even finished curing. What they cannot do is see through several hundred feet of solid granite. Everything the world currently knows about the inside of Pickaxe Mountain is inference built from what happens on the surface, the trucks, the cranes, the sealed portals, rather than direct observation of what lies beneath. That is precisely why inspector access matters so much more here than it would at a facility built in the open. At Natanz, at Fordow, at Isfahan, however damaged and inaccessible they currently are, the world has decades of prior inspection history, blueprints on file, a baseline understanding of what those facilities contain even when current access is blocked. Pickaxe Mountain has no such baseline. It has never been declared in full, never been walked through by an IAEA team, never had its true purpose confirmed by anyone outside Iran's own government. Which means that even if construction stopped tomorrow, even if Tehran opened the gates and invited every inspector on the planet inside, the world would essentially be seeing the site for the very first time, with years of accumulated unverified excavation to make sense of retroactively. Layer onto that the diplomatic tightrope both governments are currently walking, because neither side can afford to treat this discovery the same way it might have treated similar findings before the war. For Washington, publicly accusing Iran of violating the memorandum risks collapsing a ceasefire that took months of painstaking negotiation to secure, one that has, whatever its imperfections, stopped the missiles and reopened at least partial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. American officials have thus far responded to the satellite reporting with notable caution, acknowledging the imagery without yet declaring it a formal violation requiring a response, and the IAEA itself declined to answer detailed questions from reporters on whether it would even seek access to the site. That's a posture that reflects how much political and strategic capital has already been invested in keeping this fragile peace intact. For Tehran, the calculation cuts the opposite way, openly admitting the site's purpose or granting the access that would resolve the ambiguity once and for all would mean either confirming activity that plainly violates the agreement it just signed, handing hardliners in Washington and Jerusalem the exact evidence they have been waiting for, or proving the site truly is nothing more than a fortified assembly facility, which would mean stripping away one of the few remaining pieces of strategic ambiguity Iran still holds after a war that destroyed almost everything else in its nuclear arsenal. Ambiguity, in other words, may be the entire point. A government that has lost its air defenses, lost its senior military leadership, lost its supreme leader, and lost the vast majority of its declared nuclear infrastructure, has very few cards left to play at the negotiating table. And an opaque mountain that the rest of the world cannot definitively rule out as a weapon site may be one of the last ones Tehran has any interest in giving up voluntarily. None of this exists in a vacuum, either. The broader picture of Iran's military posture since the war ended offers useful context for how seriously to weigh what is happening at Pickaxe Mountain. Even as its declared nuclear sites sat in ruins, reporting based on expert assessments indicates Iran still retains a substantial ballistic missile arsenal, with estimates suggesting roughly 1,000 missiles distributed across a network of storage sites. Iran has reportedly already restored access to 50 of 69 tunnel entrances across 18 separate underground missile facilities since the ceasefire took hold, repairing damaged access roads to restore full logistical movement at those sites. That's a separate but parallel indication that Tehran has been selectively rebuilding military capacity, even while negotiating the broader terms of peace. Iran's drone production likewise appears to have continued, with its principal attack drone remaining both cheap to produce and difficult to fully interdict, given the diffuse, sanctions-evading supply chains feeding its components. None of this proves what sits behind the sealed tunnel inside Pickaxe Mountain. But it establishes a consistent pattern worth naming plainly. Across almost every category of military capability the war was fought to dismantle, Iran appears to be quietly, incrementally rebuilding wherever it retains the physical and logistical ability to do so, testing the boundaries of an agreement that was always going to depend more on trust than on enforcement mechanisms capable of reaching hundreds of feet into solid granite. And this is precisely why the timing lines up the way it does with everything else happening inside Iran right now. This latest wave of satellite imagery is surfacing in the same narrow window as a nationwide funeral for the country's slain supreme leader, in the same window as a fractured succession at the very top of the regime, in the same window as members of Iran's own religious and political establishment, publicly challenging their own negotiators, and in the same window as a hard deadline bearing down on Iran-aligned armed factions in Iraq, who have been ordered to disarm by the end of September or face prosecution as unlawful combatants. A government that's consumed by internal crisis, this stretched across multiple simultaneous emergencies, might reasonably be expected to deprioritize a slow-moving construction project at a single mountain. Instead, the imagery shows the opposite. Continued investment, continued vehicles, continued hardening, even as the rest of the state's attention is visibly consumed elsewhere. That persistence, choosing to keep funding and staffing an active construction site at the one facility the world is watching most closely, even during a period of domestic chaos that would give any government ample cover to quietly pause it, tells its own story about how much strategic priority Tehran still places on whatever this mountain ultimately becomes. It is worth spending a moment on Fordow specifically because the contrast between how that site and Pickaxe Mountain are currently being handled says something important about which parts of Iran's nuclear architecture Tehran considers genuinely finished and which it does not. Fordow, built deep inside a mountain north of the holy city of Qom, was one of the primary targets of last year's bombing campaign, and the damage there appears, by every account available, to be real and lasting. Analysts describe the access roads leading toward its tunnel entrances as deliberately obstructed with an unusual, almost engineered precision. Earthen and rocky mounds spaced out to form a series of chicanes rather than a single simple blockade, a pattern that suggests these barriers were placed specifically to slow and complicate any vehicle attempting rapid access, rather than to seal the site permanently. The tunnel portals themselves remain backfilled with dirt, unchanged across months of continued monitoring, with no observed construction activity, no cranes, no trucks, no fresh concrete. Whatever Fordow once was, the imagery consistently shows a site that has not been reactivated since the war ended. Isfahan tells the same story. Tunnel entrances, still buried under displaced earth from the original strikes, month after month of satellite passes, showing nothing that resembles rebuilding. 2 of Iran's most significant enrichment-related facilities, in other words, appear to have genuinely gone quiet. Only one has not, and it happens to be the one facility that international inspectors have never been permitted to examine even once across years of construction. A distinction that becomes harder to explain away as simple coincidence the longer it persists. That's ultimately the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire story. The reason a single mountain in central Iran has become one of the most closely watched pieces of real estate on the planet. Modern verification technology is extraordinarily good at answering the question of whether something is happening. It is far less capable of answering the question of what exactly is happening once the activity in question moves underground and behind a wall of official silence. Every government involved in the standoff, Washington managing a ceasefire it needs to hold, Jerusalem watching for the pretext it has said for months it expects to eventually need, Tehran calculating how much ambiguity it can preserve without triggering the exact military response. It just spent a war trying to survive, understands this limitation perfectly, and every one of them is making decisions shaped by it. The mountain does not need to contain a functioning weapons program today to matter enormously. It only needs to remain unverifiable long enough for someone, somewhere, to conclude that the risk of leaving it unresolved has become greater than the risk of finding out for certain. Whether that reckoning arrives through diplomacy, through a negotiated inspection finally granted, or through another round of strikes aimed at settling the question by force, is the single largest open variable hanging over an already fragile peace. And it is being decided right now, one satellite pass at a time, by people watching a mountain that refuses to explain itself. So what happens next? Nobody outside a small circle of officials in Tehran can say with certainty, but the range of realistic outcomes is not particularly wide. One path leads toward genuine transparency. International pressure mounting to the point where Iran calculates that opening Pickaxe Mountain to inspectors costs less than continuing to stonewall, trading a small, controlled loss of ambiguity for a larger gain in sanctions relief and diplomatic goodwill. The second path leads toward continued stalemate, construction proceeding indefinitely behind a wall of official silence, satellite reports accumulating month after month without ever quite producing the smoking gun needed to force a crisis, the mountain becoming a permanent unresolved irritant sitting beneath an otherwise functioning ceasefire. And a third path, the one Israeli officials have been most explicit about keeping on the table, leads back to military action. A unilateral or coordinated strike aimed at finishing what the initial war left undone, on the theory that a fortified, unverified tunnel complex sitting a mile from Iran's most important nuclear facility is not a risk any government committed to preventing an Iranian weapon can simply leave standing indefinitely. Each of those 3 paths carries its own cascade of consequences for a region that has already fought one war this year, for global oil markets still recalibrating around a partially reopened Strait of Hormuz, and for a fragile diplomatic architecture that depends, more than anything else, on both signatories actually believing the other intends to honor what it signed. It is also worth remembering, before drawing any final conclusions, that satellite imagery analysis is itself an evolving science dependent on weather conditions, orbital timing, and the resolution limits of commercial imaging providers, which means even the most rigorous open source assessments carry margins of uncertainty that trained analysts are careful to acknowledge rather than paper over. The institute tracking Pickaxe Mountain has repeatedly qualified its own findings, noting what can be confidently observed versus what remains inferred, resisting the temptation to declare a secret weapons program simply because a mountain looks suspicious from above. That restraint is itself part of the story, a reminder that the most responsible version of this narrative is not the one that reaches for the most alarming possible conclusion, but the one that sits uncomfortably in the space between confirmed fact and open question, tracking the trend line of activity month after month, and letting the accumulated weight of evidence speak for itself, rather than forcing a verdict the evidence does not yet fully support. And so the trend line is what matters most right now. Not a single photograph, not one crane or one truck, but the pattern across years, construction beginning long before the war, continuing through the war, resuming within weeks of a ceasefire, meant to freeze it entirely, persisting even as the government responsible for it manages a funeral, a succession crisis, and a fracturing negotiating position all at once. Patterns like that do not resolve themselves quietly. What can be verified? The tunnel complex is real, its scale is real, its fortification is ongoing and accelerating as of the most recent imagery available, and its construction appears to directly contradict the specific terms of an agreement Iran voluntarily signed only weeks ago. What can be verified? The 3 sites Iran has officially acknowledged as its nuclear program lie damaged and largely inactive, while the one site nobody has ever been allowed to inspect is the only one actively growing. What can be verified? A stockpile of highly enriched uranium remains unaccounted for in terms of its precise current location, and no government has publicly confirmed neutralizing it. What cannot be verified, at least not yet, not from outside that mountain, is whether the sealed tunnel within the tunnel holds nothing more than empty rock and reinforced concrete, or whether it holds the beginning of something the rest of the world has spent years trying to prevent. Iran says, trust us. The satellites say, watch us instead. And for now, watching is the only tool anyone outside that mountain actually has. The question was never really whether Pickaxe Mountain exists. Every intelligence service, every satellite company, every nuclear watchdog agrees that it does, in exactly the location, exactly the scale the imagery shows. The real question, the one nobody can currently answer with confidence, is what Tehran is actually building inside it, and whether the rest of the world finds out the truth before this fragile 4-month-old ceasefire runs out of road entirely.